Hi, I'm John Tobias.
So John, first of all, like a huge fan, not only of your work in the arcade days, but of the real Ghostbusters comic. As
Right.
that's really cool to get to meet you. When I was that age, I couldn't get enough real Ghostbusters. So anything it was
Okay,
plastered on, I would read, watch, or play with.
that's great.
Um,
Yeah.
so we're here to talk about. You're obviously involved in this new documentary, Insert Coin, that talks all about Midway and Bally Midway, Williams Electronics. How did you get involved in this documentary? Well, because obviously you worked with those companies, but how did the documentary come about?
Well, so Josh Sway, who was an employee at Midway back in the day, along with me, in the '90s, Josh has a sort of a film background. So when he came to work with us at Midway, doing game development, he kind of brought that experience with him. And I think, all these years later, he looked at sort of putting that to use to kind of tell the story of this, critical time, I think, in certainly in the coin op industry, but for us all as developers, it was a key moment in all of our careers, and something that, has kind of stuck with us all over all the years. And so he asked me to be involved, asked if I would, participate with, interviews and such. And of course, I was more than happy to.
I think it's incredibly important for things like that because I feel that information gets lost or gets confused as time goes on, you know what I mean? And it gets lost to time. And when you make a doc and you're interviewing the people that actually worked on it, you get the full story and the full perspective of the projects.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that, as I mentioned, that was just sort of in gaming in general, that was such a crucial moment in time because, certainly, the '90s, when, I started at Midway, I was 19 years old. That was back in 1989. And when I started, they were Williams Electronics, at the time. And when I started, they had just produced a game called Narc, which utilized the digitized technology that we would eventually use on Mortal Kombat. But what's important about that is that I think that game was kind of a bridge from the prior era of coin op, when there was Robotron and Defender and all those sort of classic arcade games that we all know and love. Narc was a bridge between that moment in time and what became the '90s era of coin op games, that I was involved in.
Yeah, I mean, like you co-created one of the most famous video game franchises of all time, which is Mortal Kombat. Like, how did that? Talk about how that idea like evolved into the point where you called it Mortal Kombat and like decided it was going to be like a really kind of fun, gory fighting game.
Well, there's a long story there, but
Right. I know, yeah.
So when I started, at Williams, what was called Williams Electronics, back at the time, when I started working on a game called Smash TV, which was sort of a sequel to Robotron, and I had an opportunity to work with Eugene Jarvis, who's sort of a luminary, in the industry, and another fellow by the name of Mark Turmel, who's who went on to do NBA Jam and NFL Blitz, and was key, of course, in the creation of those games. But when I worked on Smash TV, that was my introduction to sort of game development, and those guys kind of cut me loose with regards to sort of pushing the envelope in terms of blood and gore, and sort of the idea that you do whatever you can to service the player, and that sort of opened the door in terms of my sense of how to develop games. And our number one goal again is do what the player wants. And so I worked on a couple of those games, and then that led to what became Mortal Kombat. And while I was working in the department in those early years, I met Ed Boon, who he was at Williams for quite a while. Actually, he had been programming pinball machines, and then right around the time that I joined, the company, Ed came down from the pinball department and joined the video department. He worked on a couple of football games prior to us kind of getting together and doing what would become Mortal Kombat. But the idea for us started out as we wanted to do a fighting game. We wanted to certainly do our own unique take on it. And we wanted to take advantage of the digitizing technology that Williams was known for, and had sort of, they had tools and hardware sort of geared towards digitizing graphics, and we wanted to take advantage of that. I hadn't had that opportunity yet because my Smash TV and its sequel Total Carnage, both of those games were hand-drawn sprites, and so a little bit of a different way of sort of creating art, and so my opportunity with Mortal Kombat certainly was going to take advantage again of the digitizing technique.
So where did the idea for like these characters and concepts kind of come from? Like, where did you draw inspiration to make the designs for like Scorpion, Liu Kang, Raiden? Like, I mean, at that time it was early '90s, so Ninja Turtles were very big at the time. I know the ninja thing was kind of cool. Everyone liked ninjas at that time. Three Ninjas Kick Back, and those movies were all doing very well. But where were your inspirations when you were designing the characters as an artist? To see, here's how this is what they're gonna look like. What was that process like for you?
It's interesting because I think that one of the things that sort of aided in our direction was, believe it or not, the limitations of the technology that we were working with. So the idea that we had a very limited color palette, obviously the screen resolution was extremely limited. We had a time constraint in terms of the amount of time that we had to actually create the game. And so all those things kind of factored in some of the choices that we made. And so when we, decided to use the digitizing technique, we knew that there was going to be very little sort of hand touch up to the pixels that we were going to be able to do because of time constraints. And so we sort of just let ourselves fall into the raw quality of digitized graphics. So when you look at the first Mortal Kombat game, there's sort of a gritty look to it, and that I think has to do with that choice. The other thing that we had to kind of contend with was a limited color palette. And so when you look at characters like Scorpion and Sub-Zero, the fact that they really are just kind of composed of three colors and very simple sort of geometric shape language, that had to do with the screen resolution and the palette limitations. And so I think those constraints sort of funneled us into good design by accident in a lot of ways, because we couldn't have detailed the characters out more if we wanted to. We just were not capable of doing it. So I think it sort of forced us to adhere to good design principles. But Ed Boon and myself, in terms of who the characters are and the fiction behind them and all those things, we really kind of pulled from everything that inspired us growing up. So for me, I was a big Kung Fu fan. Loved Kung Fu films, loved comic books. Ed, same thing, loved comic books. We were big film buffs. And so all these things that kind of inspired us growing up as kids, we sort of threw into what I think became Mortal Kombat in terms of the characters and the fiction and the lore. Certainly it kind of took a life of its own, but I know that personally my inspiration, I'm a product of the things that I consumed as a child, and I brought all that with me, into what became Mortal Kombat. And I would say the same thing with Ed as well.
Like as an artist, I mean, my sources are correct. You're basically trained to be an artist and graphic designer. Like you like to create things and draw things. How do you think that the tools you had access to back in those days were probably pen and paper, or like very expensive suites you had to hooked up to computers to make this pixel art? What are your thoughts on how those tools have evolved today? And like now you can practically do everything out of your home on like a mid-range PC on a Wacom tablet.
Right. Yeah. It's funny because obviously I'm still involved in game development today. And when I talk to younger folks, younger developers, and when I try to describe how crude the tools were that we had to work with back in the day, I think it's almost like it's difficult to understand. It's like we didn't have transparency. There was no anti-aliasing. There was, the screen resolution was 320 by 240. I mean, that's incredible. How limited we were. And so a lot of what you see that we did back then was, again, based on those limitations, and the choices we made were geared toward, dealing with those things. And so I think that obviously the tools that we have today, actually, if you look at the Mortal Kombat of today compared to what we were doing, back in the Stone Ages, it's amazing. And I think that, I think I'm fortunate to have watched, that transition take place, sort of the improvements in technology, over the years. And so I think, for me, it's I got involved in the industry when I was very young, but again, watching that transition happen has been nothing short of amazing.
Can you take me back to, you've done Smash TV, you've released Mortal Kombat, because I know back then it took a little bit of time to get feedback on things, whether they were good or bad, if they were selling well or not. Can you take me to where you realized that this game was really starting to take off and that you were gonna have to make another one eventually, and that it was very popular? Like, what was going through your mind? Can you take us through that day when you finally realized that?
What I remember was, specifically with coin-op development, was there was, when we developed the game, there was typically a weekend test that we had done early on, in its development, where the game we'd put it out on location. It's, a coin-op machine, put it in an arcade, and watch how it performed, and for us, there's nothing more organic than that. It was literally a black cabinet. There was no art on the side of it. The marquee was like a Xerox copied piece of artwork. And we rolled it in the machine. We rolled it into the arcade and turned the machine on. And then you would just hope that players would discover it. And it was all organic. There was no advertising, there was nothing. And what that game consisted of was entirely our creation, and there was no focus group testing, all the things that we do today with games just was almost, was non-existent back then. Anyway, that weekend, based on the performance of the game, we knew, and the reaction of the players who played it, we knew that we had something special. I mean, we felt when we played the game in the office, there was an excitement around it. So we felt like, hey, we're onto something here. But it wasn't really until that first weekend test that we started kind of validated, this idea that, hey, this could be something special. And certainly the player reactions that weekend led us to believe that, we were heading in a good direction. But that was I think the first moment where we sort of thought, wow, this is gonna work out pretty well. Specifically because I remember that first weekend, Street Fighter 2 was huge, in the arcades. And when we turned our machine on, we didn't know if anybody was gonna migrate over. And I remember that Friday turning the machine on, and slowly there was a trickle of players, coming over. And by the end of that weekend, Sunday night, I remember we had a huge crowd of players around, Mortal Kombat, and we knew that we could compete.
Did you ever, if you remember, obviously the game had a huge amount of controversy when it came out because of the violence, and you look back at it now and it's laughably over the top with 7 skulls and 8 rib cages flying over, but it was a point of controversy back in the 90s. Do you remember having to did you ever get any harassing phone calls or angry letters about parents saying how your game was too violent or whatnot?
Yeah, we were pretty much shielded from all of that stuff. And Ed and I and the team, we were always heads down working on the next iteration of the game. And I mentioned earlier, our goal was always to service the player, and we thought that if we were doing things that were providing entertainment for the player, then we were doing our jobs. And if that meant that there was some over-the-top violence, well, then we were not going to be shy about including that in the game. And so, while all that controversy was kind of happening, we were aware of it, but never did we let it, affect, the choices that we were making in the game. I would say, with the exception of, I think friendships kind of came out of the controversy as sort of us thumbing our noses at the whole thing. But never did we compromise, any choices that we made in developing the games.
As an artist, I mean, it's got to feel good to have designed a lot of these characters and created this story arc that is still around today. I mean, I'm pretty sure I could show my 10-year-old nephew a picture of Scorpion and he would know who he is just based off the picture, because that design is just it's with all these designs have withstood the test of time, and although they've been changed, their core values are all still there in every game, from Mortal Kombat 1 to Mortal Kombat 11.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, there were some choices we made early on based on the limitations of the hardware that we were working on, that kind of forced us into making, I think, good design choices in terms of the simplicity of the character design. But I know that with regard to the fiction of the characters, the foundation of it, we were conscious of this idea that if we could provide sort of a high level premise and just give the players enough material, given the fact that it was a coin-op game, there's not a whole lot of story exposition that we were going to be able to tell. So we were going to have to rely on things like character archetypes. The base look of the characters had to sort of help sort of explain who they were and give the player a sense of how they fit within this larger universe, just kind of based on the visual that was there and based on the character archetype and based on, I always say that, Liu Kang kind of resembling Bruce Lee was not by accident. Anything that we could do that would allow the player to look at a character and go, oh, I recognize that character. They may not know right off the top of their head where they've seen it before, but it gives them a general direction on who that character is and how they can relate to the character. We would take advantage of that. And so we did that. The early games, I think we did that with that initial roster of characters. It was a little bit easier when the roster of characters was smaller, because we could stick to archetypes and the relationships between the different characters. Liu Kang being the hero and Shang Tsung being the villain and Johnny Cage being the sidekick, things like that. But as the roster grew, that became sort of harder and harder, for us to maintain. But, when you look at the games today, I think that because of the amazing ability to tell story exposition, in this modern era, they're able to kind of really take advantage of that and sort of tell the story that I wish we could have told back in the day. But again, I think we made good choices with sort of the core of the story and the foundational aspects of it that, you mentioned are still around today. And so I think, we were conscious of it, and we thought that if we build a good foundation, that players will relate to the characters. And we didn't really understand that we were going to do a sequel when we worked on that first game, but I know that in the back of our minds, at least in the back of my mind, I thought, well, if ever I get an opportunity to expand on this story, there's plenty of material here for us to work from.
It's funny you mentioned because of the limitations. I mean, like, I didn't even realize Mortal Kombat had a story until the movie came out. Because I was like 9, like getting a 9-year-old to read at a video game. No, I'm just skipping that text ready to hit buttons, and
right.
Going back and playing the first and second one, you're like, holy crap, there actually is like scrolling text that formulates a world and a scenario and these characters and why they're fighting. And I didn't realize that until the movie came out. I think it went 94 or 95. But I went back and I was like, holy crap, they did. But again, like you talked about, it's the limitations. Like you could only do these text scrolls, because CGI cutscenes are very expensive to do, and maybe you couldn't do them or whatever, that kind of stuff. And so it's great that you were able to establish that foundation with just text on a screen, really, that kind of just evolved into all this other mediums. Right.
Yeah. And again, the text on the screen, that stuff only showed up in the attract mode. So that meant that if a player was reading it, they weren't playing the game. They were just watching the attract mode. And then again, we were very careful with our word choices there as much as we could be. Because the idea was to set up a premise, so we couldn't tell the details about, the exact exposition of the story, but we could hint at a general direction. And really, a lot of that story, I'm sure when, given the age that you were when the game came out, a lot of that story was being put together in the minds of the players. All we did was do setup with the premise. And with a beginning and an end, and the middle section was kind of filled in by the players, and I think that led to when you look at that first film that came out, and one of the reasons why I think it succeeded the way that it did was because there was a huge desire by the player to realize these characters that they have seen, in the coin-op game in the limited fashion that we were able to kind of present it, but to see those characters and the idea of the story that they had in their heads played out on the big screen that way, I think was huge, for our players. And I think in large part led to the success of that first film, and why it succeeded was because they kind of played into that. They were telling portions of the story that we hinted at, in the coin-op games, that they were able to kind of do, real story exposition. I think the only place prior to that we had kind of told that story was through a comic book that we had sold through the attract mode of the game. We actually told that story that you see in the film. A lot of it we told in this little, 22-page comic book.
I mean, obviously game development has changed drastically since you were in the 90s, but would you say back then when you were developing things like Smash TV and Mortal Kombat, do you think studios were more kind of open to just kind of throw against the wall and find out what happens. This sounds like a cool idea. Try it. Because now I feel there's so much focus group and testing and pre-production that a game might be canceled before it even gets a chance to hit the floor to get started. I feel like, I mean, what was it? Was that the story with Mortal Kombat? Was Midway just like, yeah, this sounds like a good idea, go for it?
Well, I think the pressure that we had was, and the difference between coin-op development and I think other, software development was there was sort of there was a real industry there, because there was a manufacturing component to coin-op games where they had to build these cabinets. They were going to have to build 20, 30,000 cabinets, one by one and ship them out. And so it was a big commitment, to decide to move forward with, production of a game. So there was always that pressure there, but there was a lot of faith that upper management had put into us as developers. And certainly, the development teams were very small. Mortal Kombat was composed of, there were 4 of us who worked on that game. And so, the expense of development wasn't quite as large. I think really the expense came when they decided to move forward with actual manufacturing of a coin-op, machine. I think a lot of the effort that was put in, there was effort in sort of hardware development and the tools that we used, but that was a lot of stuff that I think we benefited from. Like, a lot of that work was happening even before I joined the company. Much of that work was already kind of underway. I mentioned NARC earlier. A lot of that work was done from NARC, and in fact, I think Mortal Kombat was a direct benefactor from the work that was done on NARC in terms of hardware and the tools and techniques that we utilized to create Mortal Kombat. But yeah, I mean, game design and development is quite different today, given what's on the table and the expense. When you look at AAA development today, it's could be $100 million. That's being spent. Whereas back then, again, the teams were a lot smaller, and really the expense came with the manufacturing of the actual coin-op units. So yeah, I think because the expense wasn't so great, I think there was a little bit more leeway that was kind of given to us as developers to, hey, you guys go do what you want to do. And then there was, again, a lot of trust put in, given to us. And I think we were in a good place to make good choices, because I was so young that, I was in my early 20s. And so I was the demographic, Ed wasn't, was only a few years older than me. And so we were of the age of our players. And so the choices we were making, I think, reflected a lot of the sensibilities of players at the time.
I think that speaks volumes to you as a designer and just a creative person. Is like, you're like, hey, here are these tools. What can we do with these? And you're like, you know what? I think we have an idea here. We can do this. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
It's like the technology was there, and it was, like you said, it was fairly new, and everyone was still on the digitized sprite bandwagon at the time. PlayStation and Nintendo 64 weren't quite there yet. You know what I mean? You still had that leeway for Super Nintendo, and then you made something terrific basically from that.
Yeah, it was. I mean, a lot of it was the right game at the right time. There's that kind of lightning in a bottle. But Ed and I both had experience. That was my 3rd game that I had worked on, and that was Ed's 3rd video game. Ed had actually, again, been at Williams for quite a while, programming pinball machines. But yeah, we were able to kind of, again, take advantage of our sensibilities. And, I talked about these things that inspired us as kids growing up, and, having an opportunity, if somebody were to come to you and say, hey, you can make whatever you want, then, given, there's the limitations of the hardware that you're working on. But other than that, everybody, I think, would reach into their, the things that sort of inspired them as kids growing up.
Do you, knowing what you knew now, if you could go back in time, would there be anything you'd do differently? Whether it was Smash TV, Mortal Kombat, or your old studio, like anything like that, anything you'd change or do differently, you think?
I'm pretty content right now. I'm still developing games, and I don't know that I would do anything differently. I think that certainly when I was at Midway, I look at the choices we made. A lot of it, again, some of it was by accident. Some of it was, we happened to have the right skill set to take advantage of the opportunities that were put in front of us. And we had good work ethic. The people that we were working with, at Midway were all very hard workers. Eugene Jarvis, Mark Turmel, Jack Hager, who was our studio art director at the time. all those guys just were very hard workers, and I think it rubbed off on everybody who joined the studio at the time and kept us all grounded. So, you know, I don't know that I would change, you know, any of the choices that I made. Even when I decided to leave Midway years later, you know, I had been there, I think, a little over a decade, you know, by that point. You know, I look at kind of where I am today, and I'm still developing games, still enjoying it, and just, you know, having an opportunity to kind of work in an industry where you're allowed to be creative, I think is anything. That's all I can kind of ask for. So.